Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I'm Andrew Knox in for Gordon today. President Biden is pressing hard for a ceasefire agreement. He publicly called on Israel and Hamas to accept the latest proposal.
Prime Minister Netanyahu says there will be no peace without the complete destruction of Hamas. Some of his cabinet members are threatening to collapse the government if he takes the deal. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
President Biden upped the pressure for a ceasefire with a speech delivered just before Shabbat on Friday.
This is truly a decisive moment. Israel has made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it. Hamas needs to take the deal.
He described a three-phase plan to end the war.
During the 6 weeks of phase one, Israel and Hamas would negotiate the necessary arrangements to get to phase two, which is a permanent end to hostilities.
The last stage would be for the day after the war.
Finally, in phase three, a major reconstruction plan for Gaza would commence, and any final remains of hostages who've been killed would be returned to their families.
In a statement, Hamas claimed to support the offer. Saturday, Prime Minister Netanyahu set forth Israel's red lines. Israel's conditions for ending the war have not changed. The destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities, the freeing of all hostages, and ensuring that Gaza no longer poses a threat to Israel. Under the proposal, Israel will continue to insist these conditions are met before a permanent ceasefire is in place. The notion that Israel will agree to a permanent ceasefire before these conditions are fulfilled is a non-starter. Sunday, the Biden administration called it an Israeli proposal and said it expected Israel to accept the deal if Hamas approves.
We have every expectation that if Hamas agrees to the proposal, as was transmitted to them, an Israeli proposal, that Israel would say yes.
Critics of the proposal disagree. Former U.S. Ambassador David Friedman wrote on X, the so-called deal was the Hamas proposal from 4 months ago. Israel leaves Gaza, Hamas stays in de facto control, and then the hostages are released. This is maddening. Some Israelis feel this proposal forces them to give up two main objectives: the defeat of Hamas and its removal from power that represents an existential danger to Israel. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir threatened to collapse the government if Netanyahu accepts the deal.
A deal, as its details were published, means giving up on destroying Hamas, renouncing the continuation of the war. It is a reckless deal. There is no total victory, but a total defeat to Hamas. I say that if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to lead this deal, we will dismantle the government.
In the meantime, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said Israeli forces in Rafah are destroying the oxygen tube connection between the Gaza Strip with Egypt. He added he's preparing for the day after.
The security establishment, following my instruction, is preparing the ruling alternative to Hamas. When we isolate areas, we will remove the Hamas people from them and introduce other forces into them that will enable another government that will also threaten Hamas.
All right, Chris Mitchell joins us now for more. Chris, the Biden administration says this is an Israeli proposal, but what do the Israelis say about that?
Well, Andrew, I would say in the last 48 hours, there's been some confusion about this. There does seem to be an Israeli proposal on the table somewhere, but there are differences in the American proposal as described by President Biden and what Israel would accept. In fact, just about an hour ago, this is what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said: "I'm not ready to stop the war. I will not describe the details of the deal here, but what the President of the United States described is not accurate. There are other details that have not been revealed. We can stop the fighting for 42 days, that would be 6 weeks, for the purpose of returning the hostages, but we will not give up on a complete victory." And the timing, some question over here as well, Andrew. It was on a Friday evening just before Shabbat, which is very difficult for the Israeli government to respond. It explains why Netanyahu laid out Israel's red lines Saturday night. Right now, both the U.S. and Israel waiting to see if Hamas will accept the proposal, but the same sticking points remain. Hamas won't agree to release the hostages, anything less than a permanent end of the war, and Israel won't agree to a permanent ceasefire until Hamas is defeated.
Very complicated, isn't it? Right-wing members of Netanyahu's cabinet are actually threatening to pull out and topple the governing coalition if he agrees to a ceasefire. What's the likelihood of that actually happening?
Well, if he did agree to the deal as has been described, I think it's a real possibility. It's why he's explaining this just about an hour ago to the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, why there's gaps in the U.S. and the Israeli proposal. Politically, Netanyahu needs these parties to keep his coalition together. And I would add, Andrew, that I think most Israelis agree that the aims of the war need to be achieved: defeating Hamas, eliminating Hamas as a governing body after the war, and freeing all the hostages.
Well, Chris, you just mentioned freeing the hostages. What is the latest news on that front?
Well, the latest news is someone named Dolev Yehud. He was from the kibbutz near Oz. He was the latest body to be discovered. He was thought, Andrew, to be kidnapped on October 7th, but his body was found in that kibbutz. He was murdered on that day, and they needed forensic identification to identify his remains. His body was burned so bad. Right now, that reduces the number of hostages from 125 to 124. We're not sure how many alive. We know 39 of those 124 are confirmed dead. Especially the women have been horribly treated, and that's why in the proposal includes the word remains instead of alive hostages. And some people believe that the women have been treated so badly that they may not be alive as well. Unspeakable horror after 241 days. Terrible anguish for the families, why so many are encouraging people to pray for the hostages and their families.
Chris, last question. Given the scenarios you've talked about, what's the incentive for Israel to accept a deal?
Well, if there was any proposal, it would be to get the hostages back, but without giving up on the aims of the war. And as I mentioned, praying for the hostages and their families, it's really an important time to be praying for wisdom for Israeli leaders with all these things that are happening right now, all the pressure from the international community and even the United States. And last week, Andrew, there were 400 Christian leaders from 40 nations. They came here at the Jerusalem, the 8th annual Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. They came to pray Isaiah 40. Comfort, comfort ye my people. And they came to pray for wisdom for Israeli leaders. And finally, Andrew, they came to let Israelis know they're not alone in their hour of need when most of the world is turning against them.
All right, Chris, thank you. We always appreciate your reporting. Thank you very much. Now, in other news, former President Trump says success will be his revenge for his felony conviction, and it's already been a financial windfall for the campaign. Dale Hurd has the story.
Some House Republicans have vowed to retaliate for the guilty verdict against former President Trump, saying they'll use everything in their arsenal. House Speaker Mike Johnson said the Republican majority would use its oversight powers against what it called corrupt prosecutors, but said Republicans must remain within the rule of law.
We are the rule of law party. Chaos is not a conservative value, and we have to fight back, and we will, with everything in our arsenal. But we do that within the confines of the rule of law.
The chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan, has asked Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and prosecutor Matthew Coangelo to testify over Donald Trump's prosecution. Trump is now suggesting the Supreme Court weigh in on his felony conviction.
And I say it, and it sounds beautiful, right? My revenge will be success. And I mean that. But it's awfully hard when you see what they've done. These people are so evil. And at the same time, the country can come together.
On ABC's This Week, Trump's attorney laid out the avenues for appeal.
No, I think when you look at the jury instructions here, Judge Merchan essentially, I wouldn't say rigged the deliberations, but certainly steered the jury towards the verdict that he clearly wanted. We're going to be challenging Judge Merchan's failure to recuse on appeal. I think it constitutes a clear due process violation.
But former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara said claims the trial was a sham are silly.
And all aspects of the trial were done openly and in public. A jury of 12 people who were selected and approved by both sides brought in the verdict. So right. I don't know what is sham about it.
RNC co-chair Lara Trump says the Trump presidential campaign has raised $70 million since the conviction.
30% of that money came in from people who had never once donated to Donald Trump.
A CBS News YouGov poll found that most Americans believe Trump got a fair trial, but 86% of Republicans said it was unfair. Meanwhile, critics of those who claim the Justice Department is weaponized against Trump point out that jury selection begins today in the trial of President Joe Biden's son Hunter on 3 felony gun charges. It's the first time a family member of a sitting president has faced trial. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Thank you, Dale. Striking to note the $70 million haul since the conviction. 30% of those donors have never given to the president before. The president's legal team has a very short window of time. We are just about 150 days to the presidential election.